because GMs seemingly just don't have an idea as to what they're doing within the LCS in terms of their cohesive plan, how they want to morph a team, how many different personalities that they think that they can mesh within a team, how their head coach has a vision of the play style of how they want to work these particular players and whatnot. I think it becomes very a cautious territory or landmine territory when being an amateur pro player in terms of being an academy and signing into your first organization, because I think it can actually lead to disastrous results further and further into what you would think is your pro career. Because I think signing onto a bad first string team could actually be incredibly disastrous if you are not expecting to be subbed in to the main, roster or the LCS roster, as it were. Because if you are signing on to a bad team and you think that might be the possibility, and maybe you're doing this because you believe that you can replace the person ahead of you or whatnot. If you're in the top lane or if you're a mid laner and you think the other mid laner on the starting roster is worse than you, then yeah, you could use that to your advantage and say, okay, yeah, I think I have a high likely chance to get into here, even though that the team is probably not that good in terms of just the overall encompassing package. But you also have to consider it's just like you're getting yourself into that entire bee's nest of just like a shit team, as it were, because the GM didn't know what the fuck he was doing. And I think this entire ordeal or this dilemma shouldn't even have to happen in the first place, because I think GMs seem to think there's this entire idea that if this initial roster fails, and say that then they have the veterans within the entire initial roster or whatnot, that they think that replacing that veteran with someone of a younger age or youth is like a supplantation, right? It's just something that you could necessarily plug and play, and it becomes like this idea of youth or mechanics or even a fresh mind in order to help reinvigorate the entire roster and whatnot. I think this is one of the biggest faults from a GM just in and of itself, because they feel like it's this magic bullet and whatnot. And I hate it when GMs replace players hoping it magically fixes an entire problem, an entire roster, right? And it happens to just get wins on the board. And in fact, I talk about this idea of GMs being the problem within North America, as well as scouters and the lack of scouting. And I'll link it up in I don't know, the fucking little bubble thing above, if I even remember this shit. But it's the idea that they can suddenly fix all their problems of what they fucked up in the very beginning. Let's be real, right? You were the one that constructed the initial roster, right? So you should have at least some idea as to how this roster should work out, maybe, or even still, if that happens all blow up, maybe have a backup plan within academy. This is also why we famously see a lot of veteran players in academy, is because, well, if shit goes downhill, they could just bring that person up, right? He knows it. The veteran player knows it. He knows he's just going to be this guy that comes in and takes down the other guy, because it's just like he needs to fix shit in a quick hurry, right? As a band-aid, or as to plug the ships on the hole. So or plug the holes on the ship, right? I guess if you got to plug ships in a hole, that becomes a bigger problem. But I think GMs basically are doing their job wrong in this essence. And I don't get why some of them are being praised currently. Why is FlyQuest being praised as to removing their entire LCS roster and putting in their academy roster? Why are they being praised for this? That just shows that their initial plan was complete shit, and they didn't actually know what they were doing in terms of constructing their roster initially. And yeah, sure, there can be some unforeseen circumstances when it comes to constructing a roster. Maybe one player doesn't work out or whatnot, but you should generally know the pieces that you're trying to fit into this entire puzzle. So Why are they being praised right now? And on top of that, just imagine if they weren't doing so well with this new academy roster in the LCS. What if, Tomo doesn't play that well, or what if, the NXI guy doesn't play that well? Then completely fucked, right? Then you end up throwing those players under the bus and essentially tarnishing their name for the next season, all because of your selfishness and your unawareness as to how your main roster would even perform within the regular season. So I don't get the praise in that aspect. You're essentially dragging these players' names possibly through the mud, or they could rise up to the occasion itself. And it's like, in a certain way, I understand that players need to at least be able to kind of grasp greatness, as it were, and take it by the reins. But in another instance, it's completely unfair to spring that upon them so absurdly. Now we come to another situation, which was Niles last year, right? Or rather last split in 2021 spring, where Golden Guardians didn't have a veteran on the entire roster besides 6A, which, let's be fucking honest, ADCs, they don't know how to fucking shot call for the most part, and they're too busy doing all their micro and shit. So now what was the construction of this roster? And yeah, Golden Guardians then came out with a caveat that it's just, we don't have enough money to spend, so therefore we're just going to create a shit roster. That really doesn't excuse you from copping out in terms of the whole veteran aspect, because I think Golden Guardians did a terrible job in GMing in 2021, as it were anyways, just as a whole encapsulation of the entire season, because they had to get Solo in the summer split to rectify things. And then they picked up Licorice just as hapstance, just because FlyQuest was blowing up. What happens if FlyQuest wasn't blowing up? Then they would have had to stick with Solo, which they apparently didn't want to fucking stick with them. Otherwise, Solo would be playing currently right now in the starting roster, right? Which I have my other ideas about why he didn't. He's not in the current lineup. If you want to go check out my other video about Golden Guardians and contracts, but the idea is that, okay, now Golden Guardians, they are suddenly, doing quite well and whatnot, but it's all from the initial premise that they did a terrible job GMing in the very beginning anyways, when not putting veterans within their entire lineup. And when you want to say that you're developing these new players and, uprising talent and whatnot, yeah, that's all fine and great, but you gave them no entire course or direction when it comes to just structure itself. You can't expect to put a whole bunch of rookies together and say, yeah, just figure it out on your own. When you're on the Rift, just listen to Stixay, the guy who's fucking clicking on CS and whatnot during the entire time, and then in late game, he's actually able to fucking talk, because that's all that he fucking see job is anyways, right? So it's completely asinine to then go on and say that Golden Guardians did a great job in terms of their GM and their management, as it were, even with a limited budget roster. I don't think this is how you construct a roster to begin with. Now, let's go on to fucking FlyQuest. They can get it too. Viper got abused in 2019 summer because of his champion pool, which he really just wasn't ready to even go into the LCS, and he was replaced by Solo in 2020 spring. And then he shared time with Lorlo, of all fucking people, in 2020 summer split. And so you can see that this team, in and of themselves too, also placed a player in far too early in order to try and patch up some things, as it were. Let's go on to fucking TSM, my favorite team. Grig played in TSM to patch the Dardoch hole in 2018. Shared time with Acadian in 2019 summer at the very end, where they had all that roster fiasco, and they had to fucking try and figure out some shit, and they couldn't find out their true team identity, as it were, and then Grig then fell into a lower team with Dignitas in 2020 spring, and now he's finally able to show his stuff in 2021, especially with a name change to Armeo. And well, just thinking about it, just clearly, obviously, his Grig name was tainted for other reasons too. Go look it up. But his Grig name was tainted because of the time that he spent within TSM, and that he had problems within TSM as far as the play style was concerned and how to mesh with that entire team and whatnot. And so a name change is a good way to brush your shoulders off, as it were, right? And this is a common tactic. Like, yeah, just as a tangent, this is a tactic for certain companies to then create sub companies in order to brush their names off of certain scandals and whatnot. Like, famously, of course, you have Volkswagen, right, with their scandal with emissions, and how, well, Volkswagen is actually the parent company of both Audi and Porsche. But it's like all the news attention was, of course, on Volkswagen. And that's why everyone remembers that Volkswagen was responsible for being dodgy on their emissions and shit and whatnot. So, Grig is basically Volkswagen. Just kidding. But Grig, now he gets a new start, or Armeo now gets a new start, right? And so this whole idea of just academy players aren't meant to be your fucking band-aid solution in terms of rectifying your team or plugging the holes in the ship, as it were. And so just putting in players far too early, then you're basically saying that you would rather sacrifice that player for your fault as a GM. And I feel like that's actually what's happening, is that GMs are doing all these different moves in order to try and maybe make some magic puzzle work out. This is why I say CLG back in the day, when they had fucking Weldon and they were just throwing in players left and right, and they constructed their roster in such a shitty way because they were going off of stats purely rather than both stats, personality, and the eye test itself. And so now you come to this point to where you're relying on academy players in order to fix your entire team, which should not be the circumstances that you put these young players in, and you're kind of trying to take advantage of them. So that's why I say I think academy players should be a little bit more cautious when it comes to signing some of these deals, looking at maybe the main roster, not just your academy roster, in terms of exactly how your career is going to pan out, because you could be subbed in unexpectedly when you really would feel a little bit more comfortable spending more time in academy. So I think this entire situation is just pretty fucked up. GMs are fucking up a lot, and it's kind of putting all these young players under the bus. And this is why I think there's a fundamental problem with the academy system in and of itself, because it's used as a band-aid system rather than a training and learning ground, as it were, to build up these younger players.